Okay, good morning. I'm Robert Wright of the Scottish Council Archives. Welcome along today. I'm delighted that we're once again being joined by Dr. Ellie Pridgeon to look at copyright duration. This is the second in our series of copyright webinars, and if you didn't attend the first one, it is available on the SCA website. I'm just going to say a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces, just to let you know that we are recording. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, please do remember to switch your cameras off. There will be a Q&A session at the end, but if you would like to comment, you're invited to add anything into the chat box on the bottom. And also, if you do need them, the closed captions or subtitles are available. Just click on the CC box that you have there. But I'm delighted to pass you over now to Ellie, who will begin today's workshop. Thank you all very much.
Right, great, thank you very much. Hello everybody and welcome to the session on copyright. So we have just an hour, or about 50 minutes in fact, to focus on. We're going to start off by looking in very general terms at copyright duration, because copyright duration is incredibly complex, but we will just start off by giving you an overview, and I'm sure that many of you here are familiar with these the copyright duration. We'll then, in the second part of the talk, go on to look at using copyrighted material online, or using your own material online, and how that differs from using how it differs from kind of the ways in which you can use and utilize physical or paper materials. And then in the third part of the session, I shall have a quick look at a case study, which today is the University of Bristol Single Parent Action Network project, on which I am currently engaged, or just finishing off the archiving. So we will look at how we used at the University of Bristol, how we managed the copyright within the archive collection in terms of online content. Right, okay, I'm just going to share my screen to start off with. I don't know how to get that bar out of the middle. Sorry, oh, that's gone. Great. So, okay, great. Okay, so as I said, the first part is about copyright duration. Now, do bear with me, because I'm going to be giving you here just a general introduction to copyright duration, because of the nature of the topic, the fact that you could spend your entire life studying copyright duration and still not know everything about it. So what we're going to do is to focus on some of the key types of materials that you might have in your collection. So do bear with me. I realise that we've got lots of very experienced people with us today, and the idea for this session is to kind of hit the middle ground. So we need to make sure that delegates who are less experienced as well can also get their heads around copyright duration. So do bear with me as I go through and give you an introduction and overview of this topic. Right, so to start off with, then at a very basic level, the duration, the copyright duration. So this is material in your collection. So as we saw in the previous webinar, everything in your collection is, well, particularly if you have a modern collection that will be in copyright, it will either be your own copyright or it will be what we call third-party copyright. So that is obviously copyright. Your copyright is owned by another person, perhaps the photographer who took the photographs in your collection, perhaps the author of the letter, letters within your collection. So you may not necessarily own the copyright yourself. So this, particularly when we're looking at copying and putting digital copies online, this is very important and significant, as we'll look at in the second part of the talk. So to start off with then, copyright duration depends on a number of things. It depends on the type of work. So, for example, the literary work, dramatic work, musical work, artistic work, film, sound recording, broadcast, or typographical arrangement. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Copyright duration also depends on whether the work was published or unpublished, or is still published or unpublished. And it also depends to a certain extent on whether the author is known or unknown. The unknown author is often referred to as an orphan work, so a work without an identified author or copyright holder, in fact. So let's have a look at some of the copyright duration then. For some of this material, obviously we're not going to have time to have a look at it in detail for absolutely everything, but I've picked some of the key material here. Okay, so sorry, this bar is at the bottom of my screen. I realise can't quite see the text, but I'll read everything out. Okay, so literary works then. Just to review from last time, books. This includes books, journals, newspaper articles, emails, letters, and poems. Dramatic works, including operas and plays and performance art. And musical works, including musical scores, sheet music, songs, and soundtracks. So in general terms, if these works are published and the author is known, the copyright duration is standard. As standard in this country is the lifetime of the artist or the author, plus 70 years from the end of the calendar year in which the author died. Now this is standard. In terms of published works, in relation to the literary, dramatic or musical works, we can also have 50-year duration for the end of the year in which the work was first made available to the public, if it was published before August 1st, 1989, and if the author died more than 20 years before. Sorry, I just need to be able to read it out. Died more than 20 years before the publication. So, as you can see, this is this is just the tip of the iceberg. Essentially, it's incredibly complex, and we'll talk a little bit in the second and third part of the session about how we can make this less complex for everyone, essentially managing these collections. So, again, the copyright duration for literary works, dramatic, musical works. So they are unpublished. They may, in fact, as I know, many of them remain in copyright until midnight on the 31st of December 2039, and this is known as the 2039 rule. A work that is created after the 1st of August 1989, the copyright duration is 70 years from the end of the year in which the author died. And a work created before the 1st of August 1989, the copyright expires on the 31st of December 2039 if the author died before the 1st of January 1969. Otherwise, the copyright expires 70 years standard, again, from the end of the year in which the author died. So again, this is incredibly complex, essentially. And what we do need to know or remember is that there is no reason that you need to hold all this material, all this information and data in your head. What we need to do is to know where to actually go in and discover and read more about this. And I'll give you some links to some very useful sites relating to copyright duration at the end of the session. Right, so a little more straightforward then. Copyright duration in artistic works. Now, artistic works include paintings, drawings, plans, maps, charts, engravings, prints, collage, sculpture, holograms, jewellery, architectural plans, drawings, unique pieces of furniture, photographs as well, photographic materials such as negatives, prints and slides, but be aware that photographs have a separate copyright duration that I'll talk about in just a moment. So published or unpublished artistic works, then the copyright duration is a fairly standard then, lifetime of the artist plus 70 years from the end of the calendar year in which they died. And as I said, NB, the copyright duration for photographic material is clearly different to artistic works, and we'll look at that in just a second. Photographic copyright is the most complex of it all, and this is very challenging for individuals working in the archives and heritage sector, because essentially, you know, a vast majority of collections are very often made up of photographic material. So this is a great challenge to everybody. Sound recordings as well, another type of copyrighted work. This is separate from copyrighted words and music contained within the recording. Sound recordings include oral history, recorded lectures, recordings of literary, dramatic or musical works, and also sound effects. Those are just some of the items which are covered by sound recordings. Again, the copyright duration is a little complex, as you might imagine. If this is published or released, the copyright duration is 50 years from the end of the year in which it was first published or released. And sound recordings that are in copyright on the 1st of November 2011 and made after that date, the copyright duration has been extended to 70 years. So again, you can see that this is a little complex to understand, which means that managing our collections is also complex. Unpublished sound recordings, if they're made between the 1st of June 1957 or after the August 1989, the copyright duration is 50 years from the end of the year in which they were made. But if they were made between the 1st of June 1957 and the 31st of July 1989, the copyright expires on the 31st of December 2039. Now, I'm giving you this information because because it's very helpful in, you know, to making everybody realise that just how complex this is, and B, this is something that you don't need to take in now. You can go back, as I said, and look at it, re-look at it, study it for yourself. You're not going to. There's almost certainly not going to be a point in your organisation where you're going to have to think about every type of copyright in every type of collection. You know, so if you're working in a collection which has a lot of film, this is film based, then you know, that's the area that you're going to read around and look into. So I'm essentially just providing you with kind of ways into what is significant for your particular collection. And we also have broadcasts as well, other copyright durations. So broadcasts includes the transmission via terrestrial cable, satellite or webcasts. And the copyright duration for broadcasts is 50 years from the end of the year in which it was first broadcasted or delivered. The other copyright duration that we need to be aware of as archivists or individuals working within the heritage sector is the typographical arrangements within published works. This is the layout of the published edition of a written dramatic or musical work, and this includes the publication on the website. The copyright duration for the typographical arrangement is 25 years from when it was first published. So as you can see, again, this is a very complex area to get our heads round. So copyright in films then. Films includes film stills, clips, and the content of video, VHS, DVDs, for instance. As in many types of materials, there are multiple copyright holders in films. For example, we've got the script and the music. So the copyright duration in films is 70 years from the death of the last person who made the film, including the principal director, the author of the screenplay, the author of the dialogue, and the composer of the music. So as you can see, film copyright is very complex there, and there may also be some other additional copyrights within films. And films made before the 1st of June 1957 are not actually protected as films because it's a kind of new material, I suppose, but as sequences of photographs. So the copyright duration for older films is the same as for photographs, but comprising each frame. So again, you can see this is a very complex area. And the most complex of all, so again, I'm only going to touch on this because it's, again, something we could spend years and years researching and still not have a definitive answer. But generally, the copyright in photographs, well, it's very complex. So the photographs taken on or after the 1st of August 1989, this has a standard term of life plus 70 years. Photographs taken on or after the 1st of June 1957, but before August 1989. If they are published before August 1989, the term will expire either 50 years after the end of the year in which the photograph was published, or 70 years after the death of the author, whichever is longer. And if they are unpublished, the copyright duration will depend on when the author died. If the author died on or after the 1st of January 1969, the standard term of life plus 70 years. But if the author died before the 1st of January 1969, the term will expire on the 31st of December 2039. So again, we have, there are all sorts of issues and risks associated with copyright in photographs, and therefore what we could actually do with content that is in our collection. And I'll look a little bit in part 3 about how we can manage these to a certain extent, risk manage them. Photographs taken on or after the 1st of January 1945, the duration is calculated according to the standard term of life of the author plus 70 years. Photographs taken before the 1st of January 1945, the term of protection depends on whether the work enjoyed copyright protection within an EU member state on the 1st of July 1995. And again, this is where it becomes even more complex. There is a possibility there that actually the copyright can be revived or extended. So again, we need to be careful of some of our older works, and research needs to be undertaken if we want to do anything with our content which involves making copies or putting material online. And if the photograph is made available to the public, the copyright duration is 70 years from the year in which the work was first made available to the public. So photographs of unknown authorship, again, very complex. If they are, many photographs are actually we don't know who the author is. It's not like a letter, because 9 times out of 10, the photographer is either not in the photograph, or if they're not professional photographs, then they are generally not signed. I know some of the professional photographers put stamps on the back of their prints, but this is a very tricky area, because trying to trace your copyright holder, who is generally the photographer for a photograph, is very tricky. So many of these are in our collections. You know, we have millions and millions of photographs in UK collections with unknown authorship. And again, this is what we very often refer to as orphan works. And again, I will talk about that in a separate session, because that's a whole other different area of copyright. But if the photographs are made available to the public, if they've been made available to the public, the copyright expires 70 years from the year in which the work was first made available, because we don't, of course, know anything about the life or the death, in fact, of the copyright holder. So it's actually the work when the work was first made available to the public. And again, photographs taken on or before the 31st of December 1944 will be out of copyright in the UK unless they were published or made available to the public before the end of 2015. If they were, then they remain in copyright for a further 70 years from the end of the year in which the work was first made available. So again, this is this revived or extended copyright. So we do need to be slightly careful of older photographs within our collections, because occasionally they will actually have this either revived or extended copyright. But again, we can think about ways in which we can actually manage this within our collections, because it's simply not practical the vast majority of the time for organisations to look at every single photograph and do the research, essentially. So we need other approaches at the end of the day. And if the photograph is not made available to the public, then the copyright duration is 70 years after the end of the year in which it was created, i.e. when it was taken. And again, a lot of the time we simply just don't know this, because the vast majority of photographs are simply not dated. So again, copyright in photographs is a very, very thorny area. Right, so just an overview then of other types of copyright you might come across very quickly before we move on to the second half. So Crown copyright, I'm sure many of you who work in organisations know that the Crown copyright is material produced by employees of the Crown in the course of the work. For example, ministerial papers, government publications, official war artists' work is actually under Crown copyright. The copyright duration is 50 years from the end of the year in which the work was published. So if this is published Crown copyright material. However, if the work is commissioned from people who are not civil servants and whose author rights are not assigned to the Crown, so for example, a freelancer, for instance, the usual copyright duration is the lifetime of the artist plus 70 years. So we need to be very, very certain that these individuals are officially working for an organisation for it to be Crown copyright. Where the copyright is assigned or transferred to the Crown, so if it's not Crown copyright originally, but perhaps an archive is transferred to a Crown or the Royal Collections, the copyright duration is 70 years after the death of the creator. So standardised, and the unpublished Crown copyright, unpublished material, the copyright protection for this material is 125 years. and the end of the year in which it was created. So completely different from the published material. So you can see that there are many hazards essentially when attempting to manage material within your collections, which brings me on to the second part then. And this is part 2, copyright in the electronic or the e-environment. Now, this very much links to copyright duration, but it also links to this idea of creating copies, and we'll be looking specifically at creating digital copies so that you can use them. Particularly, we're going to look at how these can be used online. We're going to be looking at websites rather than social media or email. That's a whole different session, essentially. So we're just going to focus on using material on website, because the issue, of course, is that if you do not own the copyright in your material, in your photograph or your letter, then you cannot, without permission, use it online or put it onto your website, and you cannot use it on social media. Can't use it on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or Instagram or any of those platforms. So let's have a quick overview then of copyright in the e-environment. So, existing copyright law usually in the UK applies in the same way to the e-environment, and that's not 100%, but in most cases it does. So e-materials, so what I'm talking about here is, as I said, with particularly today thinking about websites. So material on websites is protected by copyright owners, protected by copyright, and the owners, whether it be you as an organisation, or whether it be a third-party external owner, enjoy the same copyrights, same rights. So there's no difference really, essentially, between the e-environment and the paper environment, or almost no difference. However, there are issues with putting material online. I mean, one of the issues, of course, is that copyright law differs widely from country to country, and the internet is global. Therefore, there is an ongoing issue, in fact, with enforcing website copyright materials on your website in different countries. Publication online is, even if it's not for profit, so in the heritage sector we are often not for profit or charities, but this is still viewed in law as an inherently commercial activity. So we do need to be careful of that in terms of the heritage sector. There is a risk, in fact, the risk of infringing copyright is much greater, of course, in the e-environment than in the paper environment. So if you're making your copy to put an image online, and you put it onto your website, then instantly you have a global audience of billions of people potentially. Therefore, this is very much at risk. Whereas if you make one copy, or I don't know, 5 copies in-house of a paper item, then the risk is far more limited, because obviously there's just you and a few other colleagues who know about this. And also there are, as we'll see in just a moment, there are exceptions, of course, for making copies in-house. So the general feeling in the heritage sector among copyright experts, and in fact Tim Padfield has advised recently in his recent book, do not place material on the website, on your organisational website, if you do not wish it to be copied, downloaded, or shared around the world. So there is still a note of warning in terms of what the type of material that you should be using online. Ideally, everything needs to be checked very, very carefully before you put it online. Right, so works online, so works on the internet, on the website, on your organisational website, are communicated to the public, and this communication is very significant. And we also know that copyright duration and protection for online material, digital material, is the same as for physical collections. So the material on your website will include literary and artistic copyright in the text and perhaps the images or the artworks if you're a gallery, but also in the online collections as well. And many organisations now, of course, have very interactive catalogues. Gone are the days where catalogues are just lists of simply, you know, the database itself, the front end of the database. They are many catalogues now are very interactive, and you have images that you can click on and zoom into and this kind of thing. So the online catalogues, we also need to think about the material, which the images which are public facing, which are linked to the online catalogues, to our collections management systems. And also we need to remember that website design itself is also copyright protected, including the logos and the trademarks and other marks of the owner. So just to be aware, and also the fact that your online catalogue also contains database rights, which are completely separate to separate copyright in a website as well. So using third-party copyright works online. So as I said, third-party copyright is essentially the copyright which is owned by somebody external, and I'm sure yours all in your collections have examples where the copyright is owned by a third party who perhaps lives locally or perhaps lives somewhere else in the world, but they are owners of the copyright in that collection. So as we've seen, the reproduction of a third party copyright work onto a website, also social media as well. So this is a reproduction of the work, and this is, of course, is a restricted act if the content is third party copyright. So you can't put this online essentially at the end of the day, or if you do, it's relatively high risk. I know organisations who do actually put third party copyright online without permission, but I wouldn't advise that. But I know that some organisations are you know, are willing actually to take that risk in terms of copyright. But if you do, it is essentially an infringement by communication to the public, unless the image or the content is licensed for online use by the copyright owner. So this is the point where you can actually go back to the copyright owner and say, look, we want to use this online. Can we have permission to put this on your website? And I'll talk about that in just a moment in relation to my case study. Copyright exceptions, of course, certain copyright exceptions permit unlicensed communication. So use of third party, inappropriate circumstances, including for criticism, review, quotation, news reporting, caricature, parody and pastiche as well. So there is, to a certain extent, you can to a certain extent use material, particularly for news reporting, for instance, on your website, but this isn't really necessarily always very relevant to heritage organisations. Now, in terms of protecting, once you decide what material you can put online, you also need to ideally to protect your online content. Now, many organisations undertake have different ways, essentially, of protecting their online content. So image protection via watermarking, I'm sure we've all seen that, disabling right click, copy protecting, using low resolution copies online, geo-blocking, which is restricting access to users in specified locations based on internet protocol addresses or access points used by mobile devices, and fingerprinting devices as well. There is also, of course, the option to consider making organisations' content, digital content, available in an area of the website which is accessible only to certain subscribers. This isn't 100% a solution, but it does actually limit the number of global individuals who will be engaging with your online material. And in terms of material which you have online, and I'm sure we are all aware of this, that copyright owners require that information about their digital rights is attached to the digital copies of an online work. So if you're putting an image up, a photograph, for example, a scanned photograph, and it's third-party copyright, you have sought permission, you have a written permission from the copyright owner that you can use this online. So ideally you need to include online metadata, so preferably written in digital rights language that can be interpreted by computers and search engines. And this metadata needs to identify third-party copyright work by reference code, ideally the author, so usually the rights owner as well. So, but that sometimes they're different. So it could be you need to list ideally the author, the rights owner, the uses permitted with the image, and conditions of use, which is very similar as well. And I'm sure that all of you are, or most of you are, aware of the exceptions for libraries, archives, museums, galleries, and educational establishments in terms of making digital copies and making digital copies available on dedicated terminals. I'm sure we all have, most of us have these within our organisations, but just to flag this up, exception 1, making works available on dedicated terminals in-house, so we may copy or digitise selected third-party copyright material from our permanent collections, and these records can then be made available digitally on dedicated terminals on site without infringing third-party copyright. So this is essentially a way that many organisations will get around this. And ideally this needs to be for public research or private study only. And we also have exceptions for libraries, archives, museum, galleries, etc. Exception 2, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and I mentioned last week, copying for preservation or replacement, whereby organisations may create copies for preservation purposes. For example, web and social media archiving comes under this banner, and creating digital copies, for instance, of VHS tapes, DVDs. So essentially, this is migration of format. So this is a very useful loophole or exception for us. And we also have exception 3, copying by archivists for readers. So as we all know, archivists can copy third-party copyright works for readers who are using their collections for non-commercial research or private study, usually only a single copy of a limited or reasonable amount. This is the fair dealing. And also archivists can supply copies to researchers by email attachment, memory stick, external hard drive, personal download from a temporary online site. So this, of course, is what a lot of organisations do in this day and age. And also, as we know, written declarations are required for archives supplying copies of third-party material. The declaration does not need to be signed, so this can be done by email or completed as an online form. And the written declaration needs to include a statement of limits, freedoms and restrictions, and what readers may do or not do most of the time with their copies. And of course, in-house, as we all know, it's recommended to have prominent notices by terminals and self-service copy stations on site, setting out what readers and visitors may actually copy themselves. And this comes under the general exceptions and limitations, fair dealing exception 1 in terms of copyright. Right, so I hope that's given you a quick overview of some of the risks, but also the benefits in using material online and on your website. And I'm just going to spend the last 10 minutes or so having a look at a case study. This is the SPAN project, which I am currently involved in fact, completing off the archiving as we speak, in a couple of months' time. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we manage some of the in-copyright material in terms of using this online and using it going forward, and how it may well be used for the online collection and catalogues in terms of using this third-party copyright material online. So let me talk a little bit then about the SPAN project. So as you can see here, SPAN is the Single Parent Action Network, and the project, which has essentially largely finished, except for me undertaking the rest of the archiving in August. It was a participatory research project involving members of the public in researching and writing history. And it was a collaboration between the Wellspring Settlement, formerly the Barton Hill Settlement in Bristol, the Feminist Archive South, and the University of Bristol. And again, thanks to SPAN today, the SPAN project, for letting me use these images as part of this talk today on copyright. The project was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the HRC, and I put the project website URL there, and also the Twitter handle as well, if you're interested in following the project on Twitter. So let me talk a little bit about what SPAN was then, just to give you a little bit of context about the project and how the project was run, and also therefore about what was in, or what is in, the archive. So SPAN was formed in the 1990s by a group of Bristol women who wanted to support each other and make life better for single parents. It encouraged pride in families, defended individual rights and the rights of children, and fought for a positive, loving and fruitful future. It also worked towards the provision of widespread and high quality childcare, and pushed for improved housing, training, educational opportunities, employment security, working condition and wages. Now, when it was active, the SPAN organisation was a very cutting edge. So it linked single parents and groups, and included the national anti-poverty, anti-racism and anti-discrimination networks to combat social exclusion and isolation in inner cities, towns, rural areas and on estates. It also led campaigns at local, national and international levels, and petitioned policymakers, parliamentarians, influenced government consultations, worked alongside MPs like Tony Benn, Dawn Primrola, and also the trade unions. And it also co-led the Lone Parent Benefit campaign, which was to become the turning point for shifting government support to one-parent families at the turn of the 20th century. So a very important and significant group. Unfortunately, SPAN itself is no more, because in 2016, it was actually amalgamated with the Wellspring settlement in Bristol. So this brought its life as an independent organisation to a close. However, SPAN's parenting support goes on as part of the Wellspring settlement, and members of SPAN continue to work to improve the lives of single parents in Bristol and also nationally and internationally. So a very, very significant organisation with impact globally and around the world. So the project itself, well, the SPAN project tells, the archiving project tells the story of the organisation and its people. So the SPAN hands-on history project, the aim was to bring new voices from the past into the discussion, including from working class people and Black activists. And the SPAN history group, when the project was live, met weekly to learn about research, to use the SPAN archive, that I'll talk about in just a moment, and plan how best to tell the story of the organisation. SPAN, as I mentioned, has an extensive archive, which includes marketing material, project files, published literature, AV material, and photographic material dating back several decades. And cataloguing and preservation of the archive material was a key part of the project, and also cataloguing took place on site at the Wellspring settlement, and the archive has recently been transferred to the University of Bristol Special Collections, and it will be eventually available to researchers in Bristol. As I said, I've got just a few days left to tie up the cataloguing of this very significant and interesting, but also very complex archive. So what were the copyright issues then? What copyright issues did we face? So I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this. It doesn't matter what organisation that you work for. I'm sure that you have all come across copyright issues along the lines of the ones that I'm going to talk about. So much of the SPAN archive material is third-party copyright or copyright unknown, which is, again, this is even worse, as it were, or that will turn it into an orphan work, essentially. This includes, of course, the extensive photographic collection. This includes negatives, contact sheets, slides, and prints, and other photographic material. So the issue with the photographic material for SPAN is that the material is generally undated. So the photographs generally don't have a date in them. Many of them are, some of them are professional photographs. Many of them are boots snaps in from the 1990s, which were essentially taken in-house or at events by individuals. And this means that the photographers, i.e. probably, we think, the copyright owners, although not necessarily, are therefore frequently unknown as well, perhaps even untraceable, if it's 25 years ago. There are also data protection issues with copyright with photographs to consider, and I don't want to talk about that because I don't want to focus just on the photographs here, but I'm sure we're all aware that we need to have permissions from individuals depicted within the photographs in order to put them online or to use them on your social media feed. So SPAN was therefore limited in the archive material that it could actually use for the project, which obviously is a little bit frustrating. And this includes, for the digital content, for the SPAN website and Twitter feed. So the images that I'm using today, they are from the SPAN website, because these have all been cleared. SPAN was also limited in terms of what content will be used when the archive is eventually the catalogue has been completed, and eventually these will go onto the University of Bristol website and online catalogue. So we're also very limited in what content we can actually use in terms of copyright on the website, or as part of the online catalogue, perhaps an image as part of the online catalogue, public view image. So we're pretty limited in what can actually be used because of the issues with this copyrighted material. The use of the SPAN archive material has also been limited in terms of other project activities. So, for example, as part of the project, a short film was produced by Calling the Shots, which features the history group and original SPAN members' interviews. There was a plan until lockdown and until the realisation about some of the issues with the essentially with the material, the copyright of the material in the SPAN collection and within the archive, that actually, in the end, the most of the film, although to be fair, I haven't watched the film for nearly a year, but it largely is focusing on interviews rather than on archive material, partly for this reason. But you can watch that on the website if you're interested. For example, as well, you also have limited edition commemorative mugs produced as part of the project. In fact, I have one here. I'm not sure whether you can see that because I haven't got my camera view, but I have one here. I'm drinking out of it. But again, you can see these on the website as well. So these are commemorative SPAN mugs. We also have a project leaflet as well that I have here too, which goes alongside the mug. And there is also a mural as well. I won't talk about that today, but it's a very interesting project. And of course, Bristol is well known and renowned for its murals. So this is partly why this was selected. But we were very limited in the sense, particularly with the mural, in the sense that it wasn't really possible to use much of the archive material as part of the mural design. So what were the solutions for the SPAN project then? So like many heritage organisations, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this and these approaches, SPAN took the approach that all material was in copyright, and obviously most of the material dates back to the 1990s. There is material that dates back earlier than that because there was a predecessor to SPAN, a predecessor informal group, so it does predate the 1990s. But even if there was older copyright material, the idea is taking, very often, if you're uncertain with more modern material, is to take the approach that all the material is in copyright, because it will be impossible or incredibly time consuming to trace the copyright, not only the copyright duration, particularly photographs, very complex films, unless you've got a team working full time for you that is able to do that, but also to identify who actually the third party copyright owner is. So taking the approach that all the material is still in copyright, key items from the archive that were deemed copyright safe were identified for the use on the project website, social media, and also going forwards, or being well, on the online catalogue, which will be available through the University of Bristol. So most of the material that we selected was actually SPAN copyright, the copyright safe material. Not all of it, but the vast majority of it. And for the photographs, we identified in the end around 40 photographs, which including items or photographs where both the photographer, usually the third party copyright owner, but also the individuals depicted within the photograph, as we see here, were known. So we deliberately chose 40 photographs that we knew almost certainly that it would be possible to identify these two aspects. And where necessary, permissions were sought from the third-party copyright holders for material to use online. And so either the permissions were sought or in some cases the copyright ownership was also transferred. And again, that's something that I'll talk more about in sessions going forward. So before the material was used. So essentially it was a case of setting up a kind of copyright checklist for these copyright safe, not just photographs, but other material as well that we had identified because we knew that we needed to use this material online. So at the end of the day, the solutions, they're never going to be 100%. It's never going to be possible. Digitisation projects, very often, organisations will say to me, perhaps non-heritage professional organisations will say, we want to digitise everything in the archive. Well, we know, don't we, that from a copyright point of view, that's never going to be possible because we can't research everything, and also from a data protection point of view as well. So it is essentially, for everyone's collections, it is eventually identifying what is going to be the lowest risk for you and identifying key images, key material, key digitized material, which can be used online. Right, and just before we tie up then, and obviously I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with people if they find that useful and helpful. So further reading on copyright duration and exceptions. I've put some links up there. There's some excellent guidance from Digitising the Morgan Project, from the Tate, from SOAS, from Naomi Corr, her UK Exceptions to Copyright document, which is an excellent starting point. The DAX site as well is excellent for copyright in photographs, and the National Archives, of course, document as well. And also the Intellectual Property Office itself, of course, has a duration of copyright site as well, which will be useful, which I'm sure will be useful for everybody. So that is all that I have to say. Then let me just stop sharing. Great. So that's the end of my my talk, or my introduction to duration and online copyright. So I don't know whether.
That's super. Thank you very much, Ellie. We've had a couple of questions come in, and if anyone would like to ask a question, please do pop it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I'll turn your microphone on. A general question is, do negatives and photographs enjoy the same terms of copyright?
Yeah, it's generally kind of they're all lumped together as kind of photographic materials.
Now, the next question is,
but yeah, it's always like this with copyright. It does, but there is an issue with photographs. There's an issue with photographs. If you look at, I only talk to a certain extent about photographs because we don't have much time in the session. But if you have a look at the DAX website, that will tell you a little bit about who is the copyright holder, because for the most case it is actually the photographer, but for older photographs it may also be the individual who actually owned the negative itself. So there are potentially some kind of issues and complications when we're looking at material which is kind of 100 years old or so. But again, if you have a look at the DAX website, it's really a really useful resource, essentially. And also, just before if we do answer any of these, just to say that anything that I don't answer now, or is too complex for me to answer, or I need to go away and think about it, rather like last time, I'm happy to take people's emails and reply to them after the session in the next week or so.
That's super. Thank you.
I realise we don't have a lot of time.
the next question is, I think, one of these sort of very specific areas, so whether or not you will know. It's from a chess club, and they have in their library archive over 200 years of chess games recorded in a variety of ways on original score sheets, bulletins, books, and in more recent years, databases, including ebooks and online. Is it correct that the actual game score is not copyright, whereas annotations are?
Yeah. Well, again, that's a very specific question. So again, is it and again rather complex to answer, Ian. So is it okay if I get back to you on that in due course?
That's super. I will pass on your details to each other
Great.
and have that done. We don't have any other questions just now. If anybody does have any, please do let me know. And you can raise your hand if you don't want to type, and I can switch.
And obviously, do drop me. I mean, I've put my email. I think I put my website on the PowerPoint, so you can find my email on there. So obviously, do drop me an email if you do have any further questions. I'm quite happy to liaise with people, but by email, and very often it's easier for this type of topic because it is so very complex, and very often the answer is, oh well, it depends.
That certainly seems to be the trend for copyright, I have to say. That's super. There's no further questions currently, so I'd just like to thank Ellie very much for giving her very full and helpful presentation today. We will be having 3 further sessions with Ellie, which we will be advertising very soon. They will be sort of later on in the year after the summer break. But in the meantime, I'm sure you all join me in thanking her very much, and I will send on the recording and the presentation to everyone. Thank you all very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.